unexplored RDR storylines. Let's get into it. Like the Native Americans. In Red Dead Redemption 2, we see Dutch initially appear to genuinely empathize with the Wapiti's struggle. He draws parallels between their fight against government oppression and his own gang situation, which makes perfect narrative sense given Dutch's philosophical bent and his opposition to civilization's encroachment. The early interactions suggest what could have been a fascinating exploration of how two different groups resist the same overwhelming force of American expansion. But the game ultimately reduces this promising storyline to Dutch simply manipulating eagle flies and his people for his own ends. While this fits with Dutch's deteriorating mental state, it feels like a missed opportunity to explore deeper themes about resistance, assimilation, and the different ways people fight against systemic oppression. Imagine if instead, we'd seen Dutch genuinely trying to form an alliance with the tribe, only to have his own deteriorating grip on reality and increasing paranoia sabotage what could have been a powerful partnership. The Wapiti storyline itself also feels somewhat disconnected from the main narrative, despite its potential to be deeply intertwined with the gang's own struggle. We could have seen more complex dynamics between the gang members regarding their involvement with the tribe, especially given characters like Charles Smith's own Native American heritage. The game could have used this storyline to further highlight the fracturing of the gang's ideals and Dutch's leadership. But most disappointingly, the Native American characters themselves don't get enough development beyond their relationship to the main plot. Rainfalls is well written, but ultimately serves more as a foil to Dutch than as a fully realized character with his own agency. A more developed storyline could have shown us more of the internal politics of the tribe, their own strategies for survival, and how different members viewed potential alliance with outlaws like the Van der Linde gang. The groundwork was there for something really special. A story about two different groups trying to maintain their way of life in the face of a changing world, each with their own methods and philosophies. It could have added another layer to the game's themes about the death of the Old West and the price of progress. Instead, it becomes another example of Dutch's manipulation and descent into madness, which, while well executed, feels like it barely scratches the surface of what could have been. This isn't to say what we got was bad, far from it. The missions involving the Wapiti are some of the most memorable in the game. But when you look at the setup and the potential that was there, you can't help but wonder about the deeper, more complex story that could have been told about resistance, alliance, and survival in the dying days of the American frontier. Next, Armadillo. When we roll up to Armadillo in RDR 1, 1911, it's living its best life as this proper Western town with all the classic vibes. But then RDR 2 takes us back to 1899, and holy cow, the place is straight up not having a good time. We're talking cholera running wild, bodies everywhere, and the few people still kicking are just trying to survive this absolute mess. Here's where it gets wild though. Apparently this wasn't even Armadillo's first rodeo with deadly diseases. The locals are like, yeah, this keeps happening, which honestly makes you wonder why anyone would stick around. But the game never really tells us how this place went from literal death town to thriving frontier city in just 12 years. The whole Herbert Moon situation just adds another layer of weird to everything. This dude's running the general store and somehow dodging every plague like he's got plot armor or something. He keeps rambling about making deals with strange men, and honestly, kind of sus. The game never tells us if he's just losing it or if there's actually some supernatural stuff going down in Armadillo. The developers could have done so much with this storyline. Imagine getting to see how a frontier town actually deals with an epidemic. The snake oil guys trying to make a quick buck, people fighting over medicine, the whole drama of trying to keep a community together when everything's falling apart. Instead, we just get this vague, yeah, it was bad, but it got better situation. And like, how does a town bounce back that hard in just 12 years? Going from, we can't bury bodies fast enough to, howdy partner, want to catch a show at the theater? That's a pretty wild transformation that nobody really explains. Could have been such a cool story about how the Wild West started getting tamed by actual medicine and proper infrastructure. Real talk though, it feels like there was supposed to be more to this whole thing. Maybe it was gonna tie into all the supernatural stuff with the strange man, or maybe it was supposed to be this deep metaphor about the death of the Old West. We'll probably never know, but it's fun to think about what could have been. Like they planted all these seeds for something potentially huge and then just left them there. Still, it's one of those mysteries that makes the Red Dead world feel more interesting, even if we're all just left here theorizing about what actually went down in Armadillo during those missing years. Next, the bizarre and low-key heartbreaking case of Gavin and his friend Nigel. So across the entire game, we keep running into this increasingly desperate British dude named Nigel, wandering around and yelling for his lost friend Gavin. At first, it seems like a funny side character moment, just some guy looking for his buddy. But as time goes on, and you keep finding Nigel in different locations, still searching and becoming more disheveled and unhinged, it starts getting both creepy and sad. What makes this whole thing wild is that nobody in the entire game world seems to know who Gavin is. You can't find any traces of him. No one's ever seen him, and there's literally no information about what happened to him. The only clue we get is a letter on Nigel's body, if you loot him, that suggests they came from England together. But even that raises more questions than answers. Some players have tried everything to solve this mystery, searching every inch of the map, following Nigel around for ages, trying to trigger different events, but nothing. The really interesting part is that Nigel keeps showing up even in the epilogue, years after his first appearance, still looking for his friend. By this point, he's completely lost it, which hits different when you realize this dude has spent years of his life searching for someone who might not even exist. There's this whole theory that's gained traction suggesting Gavin might not even be real, that maybe Nigel has some kind of split personality disorder, and Gavin was part of his personality that he lost. This would explain why nobody's ever seen Gavin, and why there's no trace of him anywhere in the game world. The letter you find kind of supports this theory too, since it talks about both Nigel and Gavin being successful in America. But we only ever see Nigel. The developers really left us hanging with this one. It could have been an awesome side quest about helping this guy either find his friend or come to terms with whatever really happened. Instead, it's just this eternal mystery that keeps popping up throughout the game, never getting resolved, leaving players to piece together theories about what might have happened. This unresolved storyline actually works in a weird way though. It adds to the game's themes about loss and obsession. Like Dutch's obsession with his plans, or Arthur's journey of redemption, Nigel's endless search for Gavin becomes this tragic background story about someone who just can't let go, even when it's destroying them. But seriously, Rockstar, where is Gavin? The fact that this simple side character became such a huge mystery in the community shows how even the smallest unresolved storylines can capture players' imaginations and become part of gaming culture. People are still looking for Gavin years after the game's release, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. Now, how Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela went from being ride-or-die Van der Linde gang members to eventually splitting from Dutch and doing their own thing. During RDR2, both Bill and Javier stick with Dutch until the very end, even when things are clearly going off the rails. Javier especially is interesting because while he shows tiny moments of doubt, like hesitating to point his gun at Arthur during the final standoff, he still chooses Dutch's side. Bill, meanwhile, is portrayed as kind of simple-minded but deeply loyal to Dutch for giving him purpose and acceptance. But something major must have happened after the gang fell apart, because by RDR1, both of them are running their own operations. Bill's got his fort and gang in New Austin, while Javier's down in Mexico working with the government there. The game never really explains what made these two loyal dogs finally break away from Dutch, which feels like a huge missed opportunity for some really interesting character development. Think about it. Javier especially had such a strong moral code and sense of loyalty. He believed in Dutch's philosophy about loyalty and family, so whatever happened must have been pretty serious to make him bail. Maybe he finally realized Dutch's talk about helping people was just that. Talk. Or maybe seeing Dutch abandon John's family was the final straw, since family was such a big deal to Javier. With Bill, it's interesting to think about how this guy, who Dutch basically saved from being a lost drunk, eventually decided to strike out on his own. The game shows us he's got massive insecurities and really needed the validation Dutch gave him. So what pushed him to finally think he could make it without Dutch? Maybe he finally got tired of being treated like the dumb muscle, or maybe Dutch's increasing instability made even Bill realize he needed to get out. The gap between RDR2 and RDR1 is like this black hole of character development, where both these guys somehow went from loyal followers to independent operators. We see the before and after, but miss all the good stuff in between. It could have been such a cool story about how people who've been under someone's influence for so long finally break away and find their own path, even if those paths aren't exactly noble ones. This missing piece of the story also makes Dutch's complete isolation by RDR one hit different. Like, these were his most loyal guys, the ones who stuck with him when half the gang either died or left, and even they eventually walked away. That's some serious character development we never got to see play out. It's wild that they left this story untold, considering both Bill and Javier are major antagonists in the first game. Getting to see their transformation from loyal gang members to independent outlaws could have added so much more weight to their characters when we finally hunt them down as John Marston. And what about vampires? So in RDR2, we get this amazing little Easter egg in St. Denis with the creepy vampire graffiti, and eventually finding an actual vampire in an alley. The whole buildup is perfect, following the cryptic messages, the growing sense that something's not right in the city, and then boom, there's an actual blood-drinking creature of the night. But after you deal with him, that's kind of it. All this awesome setup and gothic horror vibes just end with a quick encounter. Now imagine if they'd gone full supernatural with this like they did with Undead Nightmare in RDR1. Picture St. Denis slowly being infiltrated by a vampire society. You could have this whole storyline about aristocratic vampires using the city's high society as cover, which would have fit perfectly with the game's themes about predatory civilization. Like, instead of government agents and corrupt businessmen feeding off the poor, you'd have actual blood-sucking monsters doing it. They could have played with some really cool gameplay mechanics too. Maybe missions that could only be done at night, having to track vampires by following trails normal humans couldn't see, or even choosing whether to help or hunt them. The whole honor system could have gotten an interesting twist if vampires started offering Arthur gifts in exchange for helping them. RDR1 proved with Undead Nightmare that the series can handle supernatural stuff while still keeping its Western feel. Vampires would have actually made even more sense than zombies in some ways. You've got this whole theme of the old world, vampires, trying to survive in a modernizing America, which mirrors the game's main story about outlaws becoming obsolete. St. Denis was already this perfect gothic setting, fog rolling in from the swamps, dark alleys, fancy mansions perfect for vampire lairs. All the pieces were there for something really unique. They could have tied it to the Strange Man somehow too, since he's already this supernatural figure in the series. Maybe have him be some kind of vampire hunter or even the original vampire himself. Instead of a full-on DLC like Undead Nightmare, they could have made it this creeping horror that slowly reveals itself through side missions. Start with more missing person posters showing up around St. Denis, then strange encounters at fancy parties, until finally Arthur, or John in the epilogue, discovers this whole hidden vampire society operating right under everyone's noses. And we are done. Let me know in the comments what you think of these storylines. Do you wanted Rockstar to explore them? Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.